Precious teaching do I give you. Never forsake my Torah. It is a tree of life for those who grasp it, and all who uphold it are blessed. Its ways are pleasant, and all its paths lead to peace. Amen. I just want to take a moment to tell everybody how meaningful and joyful it is for me to be back. Shabbat morning is a special, special time with a special, special group of people. And it's very healing for me, especially at busy times. So thank you for the gift. The Hampton Beach area of Virginia is, along with San Diego, the naval hub of the United States. It's where the Navy SEALs are located. Many of your aircraft carriers, destroyers are in Norfolk. Elaine Loria grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Her family was very active there in the Conservative Synagogue, Jewish Federation. Elaine attended and graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy. She rose to maintenance coordinator for the entire U.S. Atlantic Fleet. In her last assignment, before retiring in 2017, she served as commander of an assault craft unit comprised of 400 combat-ready sailors. She had looked forward greatly to retirement, being with her husband and her children in Virginia Beach. It was just a year later, after she retired, that her daughter came home from school one day and said, "Mom, we're learning in school how badly fractured our nation is today." Her mother just nodded her head and said, "Yes, it is disturbing." The daughter then said, "But you've always taught us, Mom, that we have a responsibility to do what we can and get involved, both in our religious community and the greater community, to make things better. Now that you're retired, what are you going to do about it?" When I heard that and read that, I thought, how many times as a parent do I recall my children coming to me and reminding me of something that I said, and now it was going to require more work on my part. The mother had taught her children well. She thought about what her daughter had said, and within a month or two came out of retirement after over 20 years in the Navy to run for Congress as a Democrat from a Republican district. Running on her military background and letting her Jewish values determine her platform, she defeated the Republican incumbent and was elected to Congress in 2018. I know she was a commander in the Navy, now Congresswoman Loria. I know her because her family were friends of my mother's family who also grew up in Birmingham. They were members of the same conservative synagogue there. In addition, and my first pulpit was in Virginia Beach, had a lot of Navy people in it. And a good friend of mine to this day, who was also a graduate of the Naval Academy, he retired as a commander of a naval nuclear submarine. He helped run her congressional campaign. So I asked my friend, I said, why did she come out of retirement? After over 20 years in the Navy, she was away from her family quite a bit. She was just looking forward so much to everything I'd heard and read about her. And he said, because her family had been active in the Jewish and greater communities in Birmingham, and they had taught her just what she taught her daughter, that getting involved and making a difference is what it means to be Jewish. Many of us, all of us, I think, here today have lived during some challenging times in our country's history. Politically challenging times, economically challenging times. And yet I never recall a time in all my life in which our nation is confronting so many major challenges, all at the same time. The worst pandemic in 100 years, killing over 100,000 Americans. It's wreaked havoc on our economy. Tens of millions of Americans are out of work, unable to pay their rent, unable to have food for their families. And as I tell my students and our children, who's going to pay for this deficit? I think we've never had over $1 trillion deficit. Now it's going to be whatever it is, $3-4 trillion that someone's going to have to pay for. As Congresswoman Loria's daughter pointed out to her, never do I recall, even during the Vietnam War era, when our nation has been so badly divided and fractured, with our national leadership have done very little to bring more peace and healing to our country, exacerbating the situation. We've witnessed a revival of anti-Semitism across our country and the world. The list goes on, but I'll just mention one more. The daily protests and demonstrations, mainly nonviolent, some violent, protesting systemic discrimination and racial injustice in our country. Just this past week, in my wildest imagination, I never would have thought that the National Basketball Association, Major League Baseball, all of the major leagues, hockey, all took a day off in protest, in support of these protests against racial injustice. So the question I wanted to pose to everybody today, the same question that, in a way, Congresswoman Loria's daughter asked her. What is our responsibility, first as Americans, but here we are in a Jewish community, as Jews, during these challenging times to get involved and to make a difference in the world? One of our responsibilities as Jewish people is to be a light unto the nations, to be role models, to carrying out the values that we're taught. And before I pose this question to everybody, I've always been guided by two quotes that I'd like to share with everybody. And my parents also, they were very involved in both Jewish and communal affairs and organizations. The first is by Dr. Elie Wiesel. He helped make the household word, never again. He spoke it initially in the context of the Shoah and the Jewish people. But he earned a Nobel Peace Prize by devoting his life to communities across the world. Never again were there going to be any victims of genocide, of oppression and discrimination. And what his quote is, the opposite of love is not hate. It's indifference. The opposite of love, Elie Wiesel says, is not hate. It's apathy and indifference. It is so easy for people to just get inured to whatever the violations of human rights are, behaviors. He says you can't do that. The second speaker was one of the most prominent and respected rabbis of the 20th century, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He was a professor at Jewish Theological Seminary, my rabbinical school, prolific author on Jewish subjects, and also a caring social justice advocate, marching across the bridge with Reverend King and many other protesters over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, leading to the Voting Rights March and the passage of the '65 Voting Rights Act. And what is the quote of Rabbi Heschel? While only a few may be guilty, we are all responsible. The two quotes call to mind a 2,000-year-old quote from the Jewish tradition, from Pirkei Avot, the teachings of our ancestors or parents, however one translates it. We're all pretty familiar with this quote. While we are not required to finish the work, neither are we permitted to desist from trying. These are the messages that I grew up with from my family, from my synagogue, from my parents, all the different Jewish organizations. So my first question is, when Elie Wiesel says the opposite of hate, of love, is not hate, it's indifference, it's apathy, what is he telling us? Same thing when Rabbi Heschel says, while only a few may be guilty, we are all responsible. Responsible for what?
We are our brother's keepers. We're responsible for one another.
Exactly. So I guess my question is, and I just open it up for discussion. As Americans, as Jews especially, what is our responsibility during these challenging times to get involved, to making a difference, so that we don't not go along with what Wiesel's saying and what Rabbi Heschel's saying? And I want to put a little bit of a caveat, which is we're all in different places in this community, in our home lives, financially, our health, our ages. So we all can't contribute to the same degree and in the same ways because of these different factors in our lives. But we all can do something. And that's my question. And I'm crying out to you, really, because I live with this question on a daily basis. What are my children going to say? What is my responsibility to give my children a better world? And as you said, Bill, we're all our brother's keepers. So I'm throwing out that question and asking really for guidance for me and for each other as how you take all these values that we're taught, that are inculcated to us from the time we're this tall. Any thoughts?
I think we're required to use the intelligence that God gave us, to be humble about what we know, and to be try to be as objective as possible, to not believe conspiracy theories, to not indulge our desire, our instinct, our human instinct to try to denigrate others. So I think it's a combination of humility and thoughtfulness.
All right, so I just want to follow up on what Bill said. I think it's such an important point that whatever the restrictions are based on our health and our age and other factors, I think it's the medical kind of motto of the doctors, which is do no harm. So at the least, everybody here, everybody at this service, everybody in this community can take a vow to themselves that the way they speak to each other, the way they act toward each other, that they do no harm in their workplace, who they support politically. And that doesn't take a lot of affirmative action and everything. It's do no harm to other people. Calm the situation down. So thank you, Bill, for that I hope I interpreted what you were saying.
Did a great job.
No, it's good for me too, just not harming anybody, with our speech especially. Anybody else have a thought?
Well,
What you can do?
The two things that came to mind to me is one is the old adage, do unto others as you would want done unto you, which is basically what you're saying, don't harm other people. But the other thing is, in a broad terms, obviously we all can't save the world. There's a lot of things out there.
John, would you come up front? I want everyone to hear you.
They hear me. I'm on the mic right here.
Can everybody hear John? I just want to make sure.
Yeah, he's
I'm
on
on
a great mic.
I'm on the mic just like you.
Okay, okay.
So I was gonna say, we all can't do everything to save the world, but we all should be able to find at least one thing that we're passionate about that is important to us to do something positive towards the world, whatever it is, whether it's the needy, the poor, the political, whatever. Find something that you like and do something positive towards that instead of sitting on the sidelines, which is what I think is the apathy thing. And if everybody in the world did that, found something positive and something to work on, then I think the world would be a much better place.
Well, great. So because that's a question my students often ask me is, I'm only 18, I'm 19 years old. What can I do? What kind of difference can we make? Even when we're 50 years old or 70 years old, what difference can one person make? But I think that's what you're saying, John, is such a good lesson, is find one thing that you're interested in or passionate about. And as per K. Avot says, it is not our responsibility to finish the job. But that doesn't give us the permission to cease from trying. And I think that's the point. Find something and do what you find meaningful and joyful and give it your best shot. Doesn't have to change the world. None of us has that power to change the world. Anybody else have any thoughts to give us some guidance as to how we respond to all the challenges in our society? You know, we're not all professional basketball players and we don't have that kind of a platform.
I focus on food pantries and animal services.
Talk about that, Elaine, would you?
Well, I mean, I can't do everything. So when I'm giving charity, I focus on the food pantries and the SPCA's.
There's a great example. You know, we get so many pulls on our financials. How many different solicitations do I get every day from many worthwhile organizations, all of which I would love to be able to give a considerable amount of money. But very few of us.
Elaine can't do everything. I can't believe that.
Tired now.
And so, Elaine, I've done the same thing you have. I focus on two areas that I feel are just really important for me. One of them is food. That's why I stay on the board of Lazarus House. And I'm so proud of the synagogue for raising $6,000. A small little synagogue raised $6,000, which was divided among 5 or 6 different charities. Mainly their jobs were from Lowell, Jewish, and also in Lawrence, that helped provide food for those who are adversely impacted by the pandemic. So there's an example of picking one special area of critical need and finding whatever way you want to contribute to that, financially or otherwise.
What's your other one?
Shelter. To me, those are 2 basic needs. Habitat for Humanity. I think those are just so basic. If you don't have food and shelter, it's hard to live. It's hard to do anything. Anyone else have a thought or suggestion?
It all
Jerry.
starts with family, in my opinion. If you set a good example and you set them right and establish principles for them, then they go out in the world and do the same thing. And if every family took care of their own, there'd be no problems in the world.
So did everybody hear Jerry? Everyone was there, nod your head? Great. Thank you, Jeff. Little technical glitch. That's going to take, thank you. How'd you know it? Oh, you could see it? Okay, thank you so much. You know, and I'm going to end off with a quote or two, and then I'm about done. Jerry, that's such a profound statement, too. We're going to talk about, in Hebrew, gimilut chasadim, which are acts of loving kindness. It doesn't require saving the world. It starts on a very small level, which is ourselves first. Let's doing no harm. And then our families. And this, I think I look at Jerry's family. I know them a little bit. And the legacy that you and your wife have left, children, grandchildren, their spouses, is a wonderful way to contribute to the world. No question about it. That's the greatest legacy I think we can leave, right, as our families and those that we come in contact with, our friends and families, I would say. Our friends and families. Okay, so if anyone else has a thought, otherwise I'm going to just close so we can be, for time considerations. The importance of our making some contribution to the world is reflected in a wonderful story from the Talmud. Rome has just cracked down on Israel like it never had before. It resulted from the Bar Kokhba revolution. Bar Kokhba was they thought he was going to be the next Messiah. He was a general, a military person. They'd won some battles. And it was that, and finally he was killed and destroyed, but at Masada. But Rome prohibited the rabbis, Jewish people, from praying, from saying the Shema, rabbis from leading services. And when we get to Yom Kippur, you'll see during the martyrology section, it lists some of the rabbis and how they were killed so terribly by the Romans because they were not intimidated by the Romans. And they continued to teach, and they continued to say the Shema, and they continued to lead services. Well, two rabbis in the story in the Talmud have now been arrested, and they're sitting in a jail cell together. And one of the rabbis says to the other rabbi, "So what are you in here for?" And he lists 3 or 4 things that he's been arrested for. And he says to the other rabbi, "And what are you here for?" He said, "Well, I only did one thing. I was teaching Torah." And the one that had only been arrested for one thing says, "But you know, my punishment's going to be a lot harder than your punishment." The other rabbi doesn't quite understand. He says, "Wait a minute, I've been arrested for 3 or 4 things. You've only been arrested for one thing. Why is my punishment going to be less severe than yours?" He said, "Because one of the things you got arrested for was performing acts of gimilut chasadim, of loving kindness. And God's going to make sure to protect you for what you have done, whereas my violation was purely a religious one in service to God." Powerful teaching from the Talmud about the importance of gimilut chasadim. And then another is a teaching that's right in our Siddur. If you have it, it's on page 68. It's from a very classic Jewish text, Avot Rabbi Natan. And I'll just, well, somebody has it. Anybody have page 68? They have the Siddur. Good. Rick, you want to read it? It's the top teaching.
Once Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was walking with his disciple, Rabbi Yehoshua, near Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple. Rabbi Yehoshua looked at the temple ruins and said, "Alas for us, the place that atoned for the sins of the people Israel through the ritual of animal sacrifice lies in ruins." Then Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai spoke to him these words of comfort: "Be not grieved, my son. There is another equally meritorious way of gaining atonement, even though the temple is destroyed. We can still gain atonement through deeds of loving kindness. for it is written, loving kindness I desire, not sacrifice.
Shabbat shalom to everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, Yashikoah.